Welcome back. This is Reading Adam, bringing to you a video talking about Louis Lamour, the best known for his westerns, but I recently read a few biographies of him and learned a little bit more about the man, the myth, the legend. So without further ado, let's just go over what I read. So the first book I read was this Louis L'Amour Companion, edited or compiled by Robert Weinberg. And this is a collection of a lot of nonfictions that, interviews from Louis, lists of his books, and a couple shorter biographies of him. I also read this book, Education of a Wandering Man. This is Louis L'Amour's memoir. And also, this book here, Louis L'Amour's Frontier, with photography by David Muench. I don't know if that's how you say it, but this book here is very colorful, and it's basically a nonfiction written by Louis about the frontier. And he covers the whole of the U.S. because at one point, every part of the U.S. was frontier, according to Louis. Well, according to history, according to mankind, blah 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 blah. So some things I really enjoyed each of the books, and I have a couple points that I want to get across. I'm not going to relate to you all of the information in the books. That's not what I do. I just talk about things that stood out to me that I think will stick with me over time as I continue to just read and do my own thing. First off, Louis, just a brief, interesting things about his life. I was fascinated that Louis, while he dropped out of high school, he did a lot of travel in the U.S., but also overseas, around the world. He was all over the world. The Far East. I think he was in. Well, he was in Europe several times. The Far East, but this guy was many places. And one thing he did as he traveled is he was basically a hobo, and he defines the hobo as a unattached, kind of homeless traveler who just goes from place to place looking for work. And basically, the hobo was the migrant worker before migrant workers became the modern thing. So there used to be guys, my age, guys younger, maybe even older, who would just travel around by train, by walking, by hitching rides, whatever. They just get around and they take jobs, whatever job they could. So for Louis, he did some mining, prospecting. He also just worked on various farms. He occasionally boxed as an amateur to earn some bucks. So he was a boxer. He was a fighter, and he took some jobs, lots of odd jobs. Like he would work on ships, and I think his first trip was to England, working as a seaman. So he was all over the place. He did odd jobs. He said back then, for a hardworking young man who was just physically strong, there was lots of opportunity. And Louis he was the guy. He's an American who took advantage of that. Basically, he was a hobo, and he's part of the reason why I want to make this video is not just because I read these books, but I learned that Louis is actually a very important, in my mind, a very important American figure of the 20th century. First, he was a hobo. He lived the life. He covered the land. He's been just about everywhere. But at the same time, he was a bit of a scholar, and he had a library of some 14,000 books. And when you read his memoir, like he's constantly talking about the books that he's been reading. Everywhere he traveled, he had books with him, or any books that were available to him, he read. And if you read his list, he would read something like 100 to 120 books a year. He Early in his life, he had covered most of the classics, and then as he got older, later in his life, he was reading a lot of books that were rare books, but also history books, history kind of books, memoirs, first-person travel narratives, as much first-person narratives as he could find, descriptions of areas. He'd pore over old maps. Any kind of rare book or oddity from anywhere in the world. It wasn't just the American West, but it was Africa, it was Asia, Japan. Like, he read everything. He was interested in the history of everywhere. He's also somebody who, when he was on his trips, especially in the U.S. or wherever he was, he would talk to older people. He would learn information. So some of his information is stories, inspiration, people he learned about, met, were from old timers that he talked to on his trips. And he really turned out to be a very fascinating character. I first learned about Louis L'Amour when I was a kid. My father has just about all of his books, and I read a few of his westerns. I probably read maybe 10 of his, less than 10, probably between 5 and 10 of his westerns myself. And they're interesting. They're good. I liked them. I always liked his books. I recently read Lando. I recently read The Walking Drum and Last of the Breed, which were not Last of the Breed and Walking Drum were not westerns, but obviously if you're watching this video, you already know that, I would imagine. But I was fascinated by Louis's depth of research, knowledge. He tried to make everything that he wrote as authentic as possible. And I was really interested, and this is one thing I was going to talk about. I was very interested that all of his novels are basically, all of his writing is pretty much first draft. He didn't edit his stuff heavily. In fact, some of his stuff, like this memoir, which is actually very good, is I don't think it was edited at all. Excuse me. And it was finished. I think he died shortly after he finished it. And in his mind, there are many other books. There were so many books that he wanted to write, like The Walking Drum, which is set in the medieval times. He wanted to make that a 3-part series. He only finished the first one. But it would have been interesting if he had finished the whole thing, because he was going to have his character, I can't think of his name, Cabochard or something like that. I think it was Cabochard. He was going to have his character go basically he went from Western Europe down southward through the Mediterranean, ended up in the Middle East. And then he was going to have his character go to India, and then also in his last book go to Cathay or China. So he had many, many, many ideas of books that he was still going to write. He said there are tons more books of the Sackett novels that he was still going to write. The poor guy just ran out of time. Like he's somebody who could have lived as long as possible and would have kept churning out the same quality, the same degree of books. So a few words on his writing. So I learned that his idea of good books, or his writing style, he did work on. What he did is he read books that he liked, and he analyzed books that he liked and books that he wanted to write, to figure out how to write and to figure out how he was going to make a success as a writer. He knew somewhere in maybe around my age is in his 30s, I believe, is when he just decided he wanted to be a writer. So he did a ton of traveling, exploring, hoboing around up until a certain age in adulthood, where he just settled down on a ranch and basically just didn't go anywhere after that. He just read, and wrote his books. And he did raise a family as well. A few things, lots of information swimming around in my mind right now, but a few things. Um, he was starting to make a living as a writer with pulp fiction, the pulps. And the pulps were a lot of just short, interesting stories. There were a lot of pulp magazines. They dried up after World War II or during World War II. And Louis was also in World War II. He was, I believe, a truck driver for a supply unit. So I don't think he saw action, but he was in the war as part of a critical, crucial um, moment of it, or I guess I should say a crucial area, a crucial unit of the war. I mean, you need supply. The supply line is very critical of the war. Anyways, um, very interesting stuff about him in these books. Frontier really amazed me with our own American geography and history. I have to say that growing up, learning American history just from our school system, and also just even in college, I knew there was a ton to American history, but I didn't really fall in love with the land for in North America. But Louis's book Frontier made me realize just how much there is that we just don't know, because we don't have time to read it all, to learn all the stories, to learn everything. But there's so much out there, and I realize how much more diverse our ecosystem in North America is, and how fascinating and interesting it would be. It really inspired me to prepare at some point a long journey, a trip, a long road trip around the U.S. to see as much as I can of the landscape, not just cities, but of the landscape, and to learn, to go into the local libraries and try to read some local information and history. His stuff definitely made me interested in, when next time at the library, checking out local people, local information and history, and learning stories about just the area I live in. Because that alone, there's tons of stuff. So Louis important in that he brought out, to me, anyways, not just from his Western novels, but just from his this brief aspect of nonfiction. He brought out to me he reinvigorated my interest in American history. Now, I went to school, to college, to be a history teacher. So I was already interested in history, and becoming more interested the more I learned and read. But lately I've been reading a lot more literature, and I haven't read nearly as much nonfiction. So Louis has actually kind of made me interested in reading way more nonfiction, a lot more history, learning more about real people, real stories, and also just learning about the landscape. And he was interested in fascinating everything. He was almost ahead of the curve when it came to cultural history. Cultural history, I believe, in the 70s started to become a big thing, which was studying women, studying children, studying what people ate, what they did, what they wore for clothing, how they made a living, stuff they did in their free time, just how did they work the land, stuff like that. Like, so his interest, he was interested in basically everything. I mean, he had talked about even space being the next frontier that we needed to really, that was going to be the next major endeavor of mankind. And it's sort of it. We'll get there. It sort of is. We're pushing for that. A lot of people like Elon Musk understand that if we're going to really truly continue as a species, we probably at some point need to get off planet. And whether we terraform Mars, whether we terraform a moon of Jupiter or something, or we even get beyond and out of our own galaxy, at some point, this space really is the eternal frontier. And the American West, the entire American story in North America, is a story of people pushing into the frontier and having to survive, having to make a living, having to figure it out. And they were tough, very tough people, and brave people. All the people who stayed behind, they probably had good reason to stay behind. But all the people who pushed west, those were people who it took some guts to do that, and not everybody survived. But Louis is a fascinating character in that he really brought out an aspect of American history that has not always been, um, I don't know, it has not been the main forefront of American cultural entertainment. So the Western, I mean, who reads Westerns today? Like, I know there are several different Westerns authors. You still occasionally see Western movies, but it's not. I would say it was popular for a time with Louis Lamour, who would churn out a book or two every year. And I know a lot of baby boomers who've read him. I don't know as many millennials. I don't know if Generation Z reads him at all. But if they do or if they don't, they should. And if they already do, just try to read his Education of a Wandering Man. Read his Frontier, and you'll gain a lot more respect for him. I guarantee it. Because critics didn't like his books. They're all, according to critics, they're all derivative. They followed a formula. I think Louis had said there's only like 21 or 22 different plots. You have for one example with Last of a Breed it's a story about a pursuer and a pursued, and in that book it's about a guy who's Native American. He was a pilot. He gets shot down or something happens, I forget, but he's in Russia and he basically has to escape Russia, and he escapes by going through the wilderness. And then there's a certain guy, a native to Russia, who's part of some tribal group in Russia, or some kind of, basically an expert tracker. So you have this guy who's an expert survivalist, the Native American, being tracked and chased by an expert tracker. It was a fascinating book. Like, Louis actually makes one guy escaping through the countryside in Russia and being chased by another guy. He makes it fascinating and very interesting and fresh and new. And it's amazing to me that he hardly edited his books at all. Didn't take notes, didn't keep track of things. He just he already had in his mind what he was going to do. He didn't have to do a lot of research. He through his whole life was doing research, and he just kind of like poured it out. And probably a lot of it was because he had done much of what his characters had done. He had survived in the wilderness. He had survived in the desert. He had done, with his hoboing around, he'd done lots of treks. And he had, of course, read tons and tons of accounts of people who had also done similar things. So, in Louis's mind, everything you read is grist for the mill. And so that's truly what the result of his books are. Now, one thing that I had to start rethinking as I read his memoir and some of his other stuff, and thinking back on his novels, I had been of the opinion ever since I read Madame Bovary and Catch-22 that editing and rewriting and editing and thinking about and planning and constructing and dissecting a novel, the written word, like with the written word, you have the opportunity or the chance to perfect something, to make it continuously better, to find the right words. And you can do that, but you can also be very hugely successful, as Louis L'Amour was, just by writing and not even doing that at all. I mean, he did analyze the stuff that he liked to read and the pulps, and he did analyze what made good writing. And he had tons of writing practice. He submitted stories that were bought by the pulp magazines. He did a lot of detective stuff. He did stories of boxers. Um, he didn't do westerns until somebody said do westerns. Like, he wasn't planning on being a western author. He was going to just write whatever. And he was writing short stories. So he he sort of cut his teeth on short stories in the pulp magazines. Then when the pulp magazines dried up, then he had to kind of submit something for publication, an actual novel, book. And a lot of his novels are pretty short. You could read a lot of them in one sitting or two sittings, and they're good. They're really good. Like, if you could write something just as good and interesting and have tough characters. He stayed away from sex and things like that because that had already been written about so much, and it had been explored and explored. Like, he knew he didn't have anything to add in that, and it wasn't going to add to his stories at all. So he just stuck with his formula. And even on books like Last of the Breed, where his formula, it was like 5 or 6 times, maybe it was 4 times, but like Cœur Bouchard met a beautiful woman. He had a rival that he had to overcome, and he had to survive. And then like he did that like 4 different times in the same story, just in different settings. So critics hated that, but I mean, readers, I don't think they care. I think readers enjoy authenticity, and that's something that Louis L'Amour's books had. So if you're going to write a book, and at some point I'd like to try my own hand at writing short fiction, and then writing novels. I've started a few novels, and I constantly play around with the idea of stuff I'd like to write. I do want to write at some point, but I have thought that by reading this Louis L'Amour memoir, I realize how beneficial it would be to read a ton of nonfiction and cultural nonfiction of first-person perspectives, memoirs, narratives, travelogues. How useful it is to read that stuff and really, really fully grasp what people were like, what they were dealing with. There was a book that I read a few years ago that was, oh man, I'm trying to think of the name of it. I can't think of the name of it. It was a medieval. Let's see if I can look it up real quick because I don't want to leave you guys hanging with this. Because it's a medieval book. Come on, open it. It's a medieval book that was based off of a journal from a sorry, I'm still looking it up. I hate having gaps in my thinking and stuff from this. Let me look at my book lists, what I read, because I know I have it. Anyways, this medieval novel was, sorry, not a novel. It's a nonfiction. It was written by an inquisitor in France. It was about a French village, and basically one historian compiled a ton of stuff, and you learned very authentically what medieval France was like, what life in a village was like. All right, let me see if let's see, did I read it in 2017? I don't think so. No. It's 2018. Montaillou. That's by Emmanuel Leroy. That's the book. Montaillou, 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 by Emmanuel Leroy. Great book. If anyone who writes fiction about the medieval times, anyone who does video game about medieval times, anybody who does anything about medieval Europe should read that book because it's very, very authentic. It's probably our best history and authentic history of medieval Europe that we could possibly have in our hands. So I read that, and when I was at the time I was writing my own novel, which was just a fantasy fiction. I didn't want to write a historical fiction because in my mind, that was putting too much pressure on myself to get it right, and to not look like a fool or idiot by having the wrong stuff. But I read that just to kind of inform myself about, well, what are some things that people in the medieval period were like or had to deal with, and how did they think, and what sort of things did they have to deal with, and what were their relationships like with each other, stuff and so forth. Now, I didn't incorporate really anything much of it to my book, other than the fact that a lot of people in the medieval period had to deal with fleas, insects, flies, biting flies. They had different diseases. St. Anthony's fire. There are things that they had to deal with that we don't even think about today, because we don't have to deal with. You're not constant when you're outside in the summer. You have to deal with insects and stuff. But can you imagine having to deal with that all the time, everywhere you are? I mean, their homes were not built in a way where they were sealed up very well. They didn't have great insulation. So you can imagine constantly fighting the elements, or like basically being on a permanent camping trip is sort of what it would be like. So I don't know. I know that I want to read a lot more stuff like that, which before I read these books, I would not have thought about reading those kinds of books whatsoever. So I do appreciate having read these Louis L'Amour nonfictions, because they give you a different perspective. They inform you in a way that you might broaden your own reading and see America in a different light, probably with a lot more fascination, hopefully. But for that reason, I think Louis L'Amour is an important American figure. Not just because he sold tons of books. He outsold John Steinbeck. He sold so many books. And was his writing the best writing in the world? No. Were his stories the greatest stories ever told? No. Definitely not. But they were right on the money for what people needed or wanted for entertainment, for stories at that time. People always appreciate a good story. All right, fiction doesn't work unless it's a good story. A lot of literature I don't really care for after I read it, because I thought there were elements that were interesting, but it wasn't a good story. It wasn't a good tale. Louis sees himself as a storyteller, as the kind of the guy that would sit down at the campfire and tell good yarns. So that's what you have to think of when you read a Louis L'Amour novel. You got to think, this is just a good yarn from a story in an area that you're going to appreciate, you're going to enjoy. It's going to be entertaining. There's going to be a lot of great elements to it. It's about survival, hard work, tough people, good people, bad people. Very straightforward, easy to follow, and there's no reason to make your fiction extra fancy. Why does fiction have to be fancy or super deep? It can be, and some people are better at others than doing that, but it doesn't have to be. And I don't read James Patterson. I don't read John Grisham. I don't read Diane Steele. I don't read any of these people that you see in the at like your Walmart, Walmart, where they sell the paperbacks. I do actually see Louis L'Amour books still. He still sells, but I've seen. I don't read any of the other people, and I think that's because I felt like I needed to read stuff that was highbrow, that was a higher level, and I thought that might inform my mind better than reading the stuff like I avoided for a long time Louis L'Amour books, because I thought those are kids' books. They're very basic. They're very you're not going to really gain much from reading them. But now I realize the authenticity of the characters, the authenticity of the landscape, of everything involved in them. Even if he got it wrong every now and then, because he wasn't trying to be scholarly, he wasn't trying to be a perfectionist. He was just working at making as authentic as he could based on his current um, observations and readings that he had already done and informed himself with. Now, a lot of the stuff, a lot of us, we don't have to own 14,000 books, mostly rare books. We don't have to do that because we have access to Google Books. We have access to, there's a website called Forgotten Books, which has a lot of stuff. Basically, you can just Google things. You can just find out, okay, what did people wear in this era? You know, what did people... That's one thing Google and the internet is helpful for, and I don't think a lot of us really take great advantage of that. I don't know how many writers, how do writers research? What I wanted to know more is what were the kinds of... When he talks about all his reading in this book, he doesn't say... He says a ton of titles and maybe says this or that about books, but he doesn't say a lot of what he was looking for when he read. When he gained something from a book, what did he gain? When he analyzed, when he tried to think, like, here's my formula, here's how I'm going to write my character, here's how I'm going to write my storyline. He didn't go into enough detail for me about that, about how he constructs his scenarios for everything. So that was something that I wanted more of. And I want more from other authors. Maybe I just have to do some digging, but like, how do they decide to write a certain way? How do they, when they describe something, why do they describe it the way they do? What are they drawing from when they describe something? Are they trying to be fancy? Are they trying to be very, very visceral in their description? Is there some way or reason or rhyme? Is there something to the way they describe characters, the way they describe landscapes? The thought streams their characters have. How do they construct the novel? Like, it's a very... If you've ever tried to write a novel, it's extremely hard, in my opinion, to try to write something that is packed with information, is still interesting, and moves the story forward at the same time. So I do have a lot of respect for fiction, good fiction. I have a lot of respect for Louis for making such good fiction just from a first draft. I mean, a lot of people... I don't know how many stories are mostly first draft. I've heard, like, Stephen King, like, the editors will lay off and kind of just leave it. Maybe he should have had an editor, but he kind of overwrites and maybe overdescribes, whereas Louis' books are short enough as it is. He didn't need padding. So now I'm really kind of getting talkative here, but I just wanted to kind of describe some of the things that stood out to me from these particular books, the things that I felt inspired to do, which is to read more narratives, to read more travel books, more nonfiction, more history. And that's something that also, not all of your writing has to be highfalutin, highbrow, super high quality reading. Not all of your reading has to be the best of the best. If you read about 100 books a year, which is basically, you always got a book going, you read about 50 pages a day, or 20 pages a day. You just read whenever you get a chance, free time on your phone. Just get the Kindle app on your phone. I have the Kindle app on my phone, and I usually have 3 or 4 books always going at the same time. But you do have enough time to read a ton of the classics and also just read a ton of other stuff as well. So I encourage you all, read at least read this. At least read his biography, his memoir, I should say, Education of Wandering Man. You'll get a lot better picture of the guy. This was very entertaining. This was very good. This one I wouldn't recommend so much unless you wanted a complete list of his books. Well, you can get that on Wikipedia, but this might be just for people who are really particularly Louis L'Amour fans. And this book right here, any history teacher, this would be good to read. Anybody who's just interested in America, in the land, should read this for sure. The pictures are beautiful. And like I said, it inspired me to want to take a mini retirement and just road trip around the U.S. for a while and really get to know the lay of the land, really get to learn. So that being said, I'm going to end this video now. I'm almost at 35 minutes. And I believe I said what I wanted to say. I would probably just be repeating myself if I kept going. So appreciate anyone who is listening to this, and you have a good one. Bye.